Okay, so we are still in Chapter 10, and this lecture will just cover the section titled Thinking in Objects. Object-oriented programming is a key concept to learn for 2302. Let's revisit our example program from the previous lecture where we were asked to create a program that allowed a university academic advisor to keep track of students, the students enrolled, the courses taken by each student, and the GPA of each student. We talked about how to divide that using class abstraction and encapsulation. But if we were in 2301 and we had to do this, before we got to week 6, and what I mean by week 6, I mean chapter 6, all our code would be written in main. Because before we got to chapter 6, we really didn't know methods. So we wrote all our tasks inside that public static void main method, and life was good. And we thought that was the way to go. Then we got to chapter 6, and we had a semi paradigm shift, where we realized how to write code in methods and made our code more modular. And but we still were writing things in just one Java file. Now I'm hoping most students, once we completed section 2301, we were able to write code outside of the main method and utilize other methods to accomplish our task. I know some students, a small minority students, were able to understand how to write multiple Java files and link them together accordingly. But basically in 2301, we really didn't have a firm understanding of object-oriented programming. And for this entire section, this is going to be the focus, is object-oriented programming. Object-oriented programming, and you will be required to make sure all your code follows proper object-oriented programming principles. Before I discuss what those principles are, I just want to quickly recap what procedural programming is. Procedural programming is what we did in 2301. We just never called it procedural programming. And now for visual purposes, I have this arrow going left to right. But it's really a top-down, where we start at the very top, meaning we start at the top of main. Okay, so the first line of code inside of main, and then step by step we work down until we get to the last statement inside of main. That is procedural programming. Object-oriented programming is completely different, and it's a paradigm shift. So as you can see, object-oriented programming looks at classes and how can we build on top of these classes, and how can we build on top of those classes. And we're going to discuss how all this works throughout this entire section, so I don't expect or require for you guys to know that or understand it completely just yet. This will be our journey for this semester, is learning what is object-oriented programming. But just understand right now that we are moving away from this procedural programming, where we look at things in step-by-step fashion, and we are now looking at things in terms of, can I build classes and relationship with other classes to make my program work? Now there are, let's compare procedure-oriented programming. I've heard it called POP in certain places. Let's compare that with object-oriented programming, which is also OOP or OOP. Now, procedure-oriented programming is divided into small parts. Again, if you can recall what we did back in section 2301, that's what we did a lot, where we have functions or methods in Java and C is called functions. It follows a top-down approach, so there is a sequential order to statements. It's ideal for small and simple programs in most cases. I say this with a caveat that there are certain situations where that may not be true, but for most small and simple programs, procedural-oriented programming is really ideal for. And data cannot be shared, or data sharing cannot be controlled. So either your code makes everything accessible to people on the outside, or it makes none of your code members accessible to people on the outside. So again, this is ideal for programs if it's written by one person. If you're working with teams, then again, you can definitely program procedure-oriented programming with teams. There's just some nuances you're going to have to address, and those issues cannot be resolved easily or as easy compared to object-oriented programming. So let's look at object-oriented programming. It is divided into objects. So we're not looking at functions or methods per se, but we are now focused on the objects, what data each object contains, and how can I manipulate those data that data via methods. So it follows a bottom-up approach. So where again, we have at our bottom class, we have a parent or a base class, and then we add functionality to every class on top of it. So this is better or best for complex programming. So if I have a really small or simple program, there's a lot of overhead if I were to use object-oriented programming that I may not want. And that overhead, what that looks like is additional lines of code or more time that I have to spend in writing the code. But if I have a really complicated program, which we will see throughout this entire semester, then object-oriented programming can better address how to write a solution for it compared to procedure-oriented programming. In object-oriented programming, data can be shared, or data sharing can be controlled. We do that through modifiers. The two that we've talked about primarily, public and private. There's another one. There's four actually: public, private, the default, and then there's protected. We mainly just discuss public and private, and we'll do that for the majority of this class as well. And again, this is better when we have teams. Maybe I want some people to access certain data, but not everything. And then maybe I want a subset of those members in that team to access other pieces of my methods or members. So there's different ways I can access or set my modifiers so I can control who can grab what. With object-oriented programming, your code is reusable. We will show what that looks like, and you guys will get an opportunity to see that in action throughout this entire semester. There will be times where we will revisit certain exercises, and you will get to see how easy it is just by reusing the code we've already written and just adding functionality on top of it. So we'll discuss that later, or we'll get into that more and more as the semester progresses. But that is one power of object-oriented programming that you don't really find in procedure-oriented programming. Set up properly, object-oriented programming can also be more manageable as well, but there are certain rules and principles you have to follow to make sure your code can be managed correctly. And then with object-oriented programming, we can evolve our code to support new functionality. So maybe my base class has a very limited number of features to it. Instead of rewriting that base class and overwriting it, I can just, and we'll get into this in later, I can extend that class and add new functionality, and I haven't even touched my base class. So this is what we mean by this, our functionality can evolve. Is done via the object-oriented programming paradigm. So let's just recap here. There are several paradigms to programming. Procedural is what we discussed in 2301, and we are now transitioning away from procedural and going into object-oriented programming. So I strongly encourage that you guys embrace this new paradigm. And again, it's going to be difficult, but just like in 2301 when you guys were first in it, some of the procedural stuff we discussed was somewhat complicated and not straightforward, but at some point you got the hang of it. The same can be said here. Now there are others. So one example is functional. So it's not just limited to procedural programming and object-oriented programming. And as CS students, I strongly encourage and recommend that you learn what these paradigms are and learn the languages for these paradigms and how to code in those paradigms, it just makes you a stronger programmer. Now, each paradigm has its own strengths and weaknesses. Procedural, there's less overhead in most cases, of course, and it's very useful for simple and basic coding, whereas object-oriented programming is more reusable and is, I find it to be very useful for complex coding tasks. So that will complete the discussion on thinking in objects.